So the Buddha was once a person like ourselves. He wasn't always a Buddha, always enlightened, but started off as an ordinary person, an ordinary being. And he became aware of the suffering of life. He became aware that even though his life was relatively comfortable, he was a prince. His father was well-to-do and a powerful person, so he lived a very comfortable life, had everything that was available in those days. Nevertheless, he became aware that there was suffering in the world, such as sickness, that people got sick, that people got old, that people eventually died, and experienced different kinds of problems along the way as they went through life. And he was very touched and moved by this awareness and thought about it and felt this strong wish to find a way to end suffering, to be free of suffering for himself, but not only for himself. He wanted to help others to do this as well. And so he left his comfortable home and comfortable life and went off to the forest. There were a lot of people doing this at that time. It's an ancient tradition in India for people to, leave their homes and go and live in the forest and live a kind of wandering life, just, whatever they carried with them, and collecting food from others along the way, and just spending their time in meditation or other kinds of spiritual practices to try to find the truth, to try to find nirvana, enlightenment, and so forth. So the Buddha spent about 6 years engaged in various spiritual practices. He studied with a few teachers, practiced what they had to teach, but still felt dissatisfied. He hadn't found what he was looking for. And finally, he just sat down under a tree, a Bodhi tree, now called a Bodhi tree, with this very firm determination that he wasn't going to get up until he found what he was looking for, a state of enlightenment, a state of being free of all suffering and the causes of suffering. So he sat there for, during the entire night, and his mind went through various changes and attained various realizations. And finally, by dawn the next day, he had found what he was looking for, the state of enlightenment. And then he spent the remaining years of his life, about 45 years, teaching what he had learned, what he had experienced, what he had discovered, so that others could attain the same state as well. So he had many disciples. Many of his disciples also reached the state of enlightenment, and then they in turn passed on the teachings. And so it has gone for the last 2,500 years. Buddhist teachings given by the Buddha have been passed down from teacher to disciple, and so they're still in the world today. So we're very fortunate that these teachings are still available. And like I say, the Buddha taught for 45 years, which is a long time. And there's a lot of teachings. In fact, the Buddhist teachings, I don't know if they have this set here, they're in these big books, many, many, many big books of his teachings. But one relatively simple way of synthesizing or condensing the Buddha's teachings is in what are called the Four Noble Truths, which is actually the very first thing that he taught. And probably many of you have heard this before, or at least have read it, and you might think, oh yeah, I know the Four Noble Truths. But actually the Four Noble Truths are quite deep, quite profound. So it's good to keep hearing about them and thinking about them and reading about them again and again until we really get it and realize them. So the first of these four truths is the truth of suffering, or some teachers and translators and writers don't really like the word suffering because that has the connotation of something really severe and horrible and, like war or cancer or being tortured or raped or really, really awful things. But the meaning of the term dukkha in the original Buddhist languages refers to just any kind of unpleasant, unwanted experience. So even something as small as having an itch, or having a little bit of an ache or pain in our body, or a little bit of dissatisfaction or restlessness in our mind. So even these very low-level forms of discomfort are included in suffering. But of course it does include these really big problems like war and so forth. So there's a whole range of different experiences included in suffering. So some teachers prefer the word unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfaction. So the point of the Buddha talking about this was to just point out that this is something everybody experiences. Every human being in the world, and every living being as well, animals. So all kinds of beings, whatever kinds of beings there are. As long as we are not enlightened, and we haven't reached the state of enlightenment or nirvana, then we are subject to unpleasant, unsatisfying, difficult experiences or problems. So it's just not possible to go through life without having problems like this. Now you may think, well, why did that need to be pointed out? It's obvious. Even though it is obvious, but often our mind has the tendency to want to avoid it and, not want to look at it, not want to deal with it, and, escape from it. This is actually the reaction that I had when I first encountered this teaching. I grew up here in California, and when I was in university, I met a woman who was a disciple of a Zen teacher. She was the first Buddhist that I met. This was back in the 70s, early 70s. In those days, not so many Buddhists around. And I was interested in Buddhism, so I asked, we can have a talk one day. And then she started to explain the Four Noble Truths to me. And when she spoke about this first noble truth, the truth of suffering, and said, life is suffering, and I immediately protested, and I said, how can you say that? That's not true. Life is wonderful. Life is beautiful. And she just looked straight in my face and said, I can see that you're suffering. And it was just like she threw cold water in my face or slapped me or something. It was like such a shock. And in fact, she was right. It was true. I had a lot of suffering, a lot of unhappiness. But somehow there was this wish to avoid it, to deny it, to, put on rose-colored glasses and think everything was wonderful and, not deal with the reality of suffering. So because, I'm sure not the only one who does that, because human beings sometimes have this tendency to not want to accept the reality or the truth of suffering, that is the reason why the Buddha spoke about it. He said we have to look at the reality of suffering, face it, don't run away from it, don't pretend that it's not there, don't be in denial. And then some people say, well, Buddhism is so pessimistic, they talk so much about suffering. But the Buddha didn't only talk about suffering. He went on to talk about what is the cause of suffering, and also how to become free of suffering. So the second truth that he spoke about is called the cause of suffering, or the origin of suffering, or the source of suffering. Where does suffering come from? Why do we have it? Why is there so many problems and difficulties and unpleasantness in the world? And his explanation, this is what he came to in his own meditation. Okay, it was his own first-hand experience that the cause of suffering lies within ourselves, within our own minds. There are two main things, two main causes of suffering. One is karma, karma meaning action. So the actions that we do, some actions that we do are positive and bring happiness, but some actions that we do are negative and bring suffering. For example, hurting others, killing others, torturing others, stealing from them, lying to them, cheating them, and so on. So this is one cause of suffering, actions that are done. But a deeper cause of suffering are what are sometimes called delusions. That's the term I like, but Other teachers or writers use afflictions, afflictive emotions, destructive emotions. So these refer to states of mind such as anger, hatred, greed, jealousy, pride, and so forth. So there's a whole range of these different mental states, emotional states that come up in our minds, and they sort of make our mind disturbed and turbulent, and then they can motivate us, not always, but they can sometimes motivate us to do harmful and destructive actions that lead to suffering. So, for example, killing. Usually when killing, murder, or any kind of killing is done, it's motivated by anger or hatred. You know, there's some person or being there that you don't like, and you don't like them so much that you want to make them non-existent, so you kill them. So that act of killing, of course, causes suffering to the victim, the person who's killed, and their family and friends and whoever loved them and so on. But it also causes suffering to oneself. When we engage in such harmful actions, we are also harming ourselves. And so, like even in an immediate sense, there's some harm done to oneself, although that's kind of subtle. It's not always easy to notice. But according to Buddhism, in a long-term sense, when you do something harmful like killing, you leave an imprint on your mind that will bring about suffering and problems in the future. That's the real meaning of karma. You do an action now, and later on you'll experience some result of that action. Something bad will happen to you. Maybe you will be killed. It's possible to clear up karma, to purify karma. It's not like fate. But if somebody does some negative action like that and they don't clear it up, then they will suffer in the future. They will experience suffering in the future. So this is just like explaining in a very short way, in a nutshell, how suffering comes about as a result of our own mental states, negative, disturbing, destructive mental states, and then the actions that we do motivated by those mental states. So this is something the Buddha saw in his own experience. You know, he saw how his own suffering came about as a result of these factors within himself, delusions and karma, and then he could also see it happening in the world, in other people, other beings. So that was the second noble truth. And then the third noble truth is called cessation. This is a little harder to understand. Cessation means stopping, ceasing. And it means the cessation, the stopping, the ceasing, the elimination of suffering and its causes. So that simply means that it is possible to become free of suffering and the causes of suffering. It's possible for anyone, human being, any kind of living being, to free themselves from these factors in the mind, illusions and karma, and not have them part of us anymore. And when we free ourselves from the causes of suffering, we also become free of suffering. We no longer create suffering for ourselves and others, and instead we're able to be in a state of complete peace. So this is something the Buddha himself experienced. He found that it was possible. He saw it was possible. And that it was something anybody could do, everybody could do. And then the fourth truth is the path, meaning what we have to do to get there, how we free ourselves from suffering and its causes, how we reach the state of cessation of suffering, the state of nirvana, peace, liberation, enlightenment. And so probably most of what the Buddha taught is included in that fourth noble truth, the path. In fact, everything the Buddha taught, all the teachings that he gave during that 45-year stretch of time is about that. What do we need to do to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering? And as I say, there's a lot of teachings there. You could easily spend your whole life studying the Buddha's teachings and still not, learn everything. There's a huge amount of teachings. But most of the teachings are about how to transform our mind, how to bring about a positive transformation of our mind, how to decrease the disturbing factors of our mind, such as, hatred and desire and greed and jealousy and so on and so forth, and how to cultivate the positive aspects of the mind, such as love and compassion and so on. So I've heard that the Dalai Lama sometimes say that the essence of Buddhism is transforming our mind, working on our mind to bring about a positive transformation of our mind, meaning decreasing the disturbing aspects of the mind, the things that bring suffering to ourselves and others. So lessening those, and then increasing the positive aspects of the mind, the things that bring happiness and peace to ourselves and others, such as love and compassion and so on. So I really like that, because it's sort of putting Buddhism into a nutshell, that this is what Buddhism is all about. And that means that all the different practices that you find in Buddhism, different prayers and mantras, different Buddha images and deities and so on and so forth, all these things is really for that purpose of transforming our mind, making it less disturbing, less negative, more positive, more peaceful. And this is good for ourselves and good for others. The process of actually becoming enlightened, attaining enlightenment, is not something we can do in a short period of time, a few weeks or months or years, but more like lifetimes. The Buddha himself spent many lifetimes working for enlightenment. So it's, the Dalai Lama says it's good to think long term like that, and have patience and not think, oh, I want to get there like right away. I mean, if even the Buddha took many, many lifetimes to reach enlightenment, then it's somewhat unrealistic to think we can do it in a quick and easy way. But anyway, so that's kind of a framework of the Buddha's teachings, and how, like the subject of what we're doing this weekend, how that fits in. As I mentioned, the Buddha said that the causes of suffering lie within ourselves, within our own minds, these disturbing, deluded aspects of our mind. And it's said that the chief of these, the most important of these aspects of the mind, is what is called ignorance. And ignorance in Buddhism, actually there's many different meanings of ignorance. It doesn't always mean the same thing. So if you're reading Buddhist books or listening to Buddhist teachings and you hear this word ignorance, just know it doesn't always have the same meaning. It has different meanings in different contexts. For example, sometimes it simply means not knowing about karma, not knowing about the law of cause and effect. So that's a kind of ignorance. If you just don't know that certain types of actions lead to suffering and other types of actions lead to happiness. So if you have that kind of ignorance, then that becomes problematic, because then you may think, for example, I hope this doesn't offend anybody here, but a lot of people like to go hunting and fishing, and they think this is a source of happiness, a source of pleasure, which they probably do experience a certain amount of pleasure going out into nature and, just relaxing and so forth. There's maybe a certain amount of pleasure in catching something. But maybe they don't really think about the fish or the animals that are being killed and the suffering that they experience. And then from the Buddhist point of view, when we kill, even killing animals, fish, insects, and so on, we're actually creating the karma that we ourselves will suffer in the future. So maybe there's some short-term immediate pleasure experienced in doing these kinds of activities, but in the long-term sense, you're actually creating the cause for suffering in the future. So that's just an example of ignorance or lack of awareness, lack of understanding of karma. That there will be long-term consequences to the actions that you are doing. You may not see them right now, but they will come in the future. So ignorance of karma is a problematic aspect of the mind, and so a big part of Buddha's teachings is learning about karma. What kind of actions lead to happiness? What kind of actions lead to suffering? And then trying the best we can to live our life such that we avoid those actions that lead to suffering, like killing, stealing, lying, and so forth, and we do the actions that lead to happiness, like helping people, helping living beings, saving lives instead of destroying lives, and so on. So that's a big part of Buddhist teachings, learning about karma and then trying to live in accordance with karma to the best of one's ability. And you can also purify. The good news is, even if you do create some negative karma, or you created negative karma in the past before you learned about it, it is possible to purify karma. So I say there's nothing that no negative action that can't be purified. So even if you've committed murders, multiple murders, it's still possible to purify that. So anyway, that's one type of ignorance of karma. But then another kind of ignorance, and this is the main one that we're concerned with here, is ignorance about the reality of things, the way that things exist, as I mentioned before. So what Buddhism says is that we have within our mind this, it's a bit like, the way I think of it is as if, sometimes you have these funny glasses you can put on, and when you have those glasses on, whatever you look at is distorted. You may see double of everything, or things broken up into pieces, or, yeah, you know what I'm talking about? So whatever you look at with those glasses doesn't appear in a realistic way as it really is. It appears in a distorted way. So ignorance is like that with our mind. It's like having funny glasses over our whole mind, such that whatever we see, and not just visually, but also conceptually, whatever we know or think of or understand or encounter in any way, we see it in a distorted way. We see it in a way other than as it really is. This is not easy to understand because we have lived our entire lives in this state of mind, and we're just like addicted to thinking that we understand things the way they are. Things exist the way we see them. So it's very hard to step out of that and be able to see things in a different way. Or even to recognize that we do see things in a mistaken way, in a distorted way. So, but this is, the Buddha, when he was meditating, this is what he discovered. He discovered that this is the whole problem. This is the main problem. Why we have problems, why we have suffering, why we get sick and old and die and get depressed and unhappy and have problems with other people and so on. So all the problems we experience in life are really because we don't see things in a realistic way. We don't see things as they are. We're seeing things incorrectly. And so to be able to change that, to be able to undo that, to be able to get free of that, we have to understand the way that things do exist, how things do exist, what is their reality, what is their true nature. And so this is what is called in Buddhism emptiness. Sometimes it's called selflessness. That term is also used sometimes, but here I'll probably use the term emptiness more. And that's the topic of this sutra, the Heart Sutra. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in this weekend. And like I say, it's not so easy, but we'll do the best we can. And just one thing, you may have heard of this term emptiness. You may have come across it in teachings or readings or whatever. And some people misunderstand the term emptiness to think that it means nothingness, that it means that things don't exist at all. When we say that things are empty, or that emptiness is the actual nature of things, then they think that means things don't exist at all. It does, it's easy to understand that because the term emptiness does have that kind of connotation, like nothingness, okay? So some people think that the meaning, what Buddhism says, the true nature of everything is that they don't really exist. It's as though we are just asleep and dreaming everything, but in reality, all of this isn't really there. So they think that understanding emptiness means understanding that nothing is really there. So in case any of you do have that idea, It's not correct. And I'm glad you're here so that you can take a look at that idea and question it. It's also quite dangerous. When I first went to India, this was back in the 70s, I went to Dharamsala and started learning Buddhism at the Tibetan library in Dharamsala. And there weren't so many, nowadays there's a lot of people in Dharamsala, it's a very busy place, but in those days there was just a small number of Western people there. And I heard about this one woman who had been there for a while and had been learning Buddhism and meditating on it. And she came to this idea that she thought that nothing existed, that she didn't exist, nothing else existed. And she got into this state of being like a vegetable. You know, she would just apparently just, I didn't actually meet her, I just heard about it. She was just sitting there doing nothing and not taking care of herself and not eating and so on. So eventually she had to be taken to a mental hospital. So it can be quite dangerous to have this mistaken idea. Because if you really think I don't exist and you don't exist and the world doesn't exist and nothing exists, well, then there's nothing to do. Right? So, but they also say that another danger in thinking that way is that you might think that then karma doesn't exist. That, there's no real me and no real you, and so then, I can just do whatever I want. And apparently some people do get into that state of mind, and then they think, if I don't like you, I can kill you. It doesn't matter because you're not really there anyway. Or I can steal from you because, you're not really there, and the things you have aren't really yours, so I can take them from you. So this is another danger that people can sometimes fall into, and then they just think, I can do anything goes. And then they may end up creating negative karma. But karma does exist. You exist, I exist, we do exist. And the things that we do exist, karma exists, so we do create karma, and we experience the results of our karma. So that can be quite a mistaken idea to fall into. I heard this story, I don't know if it's true or not, but there was a Buddhist conference somewhere in a hotel. And so the delegates to the conference came to the hotel and were staying in the hotel over a weekend or whatever. And then it finished and the people were leaving. And one woman was walking out the hotel door with her suitcase. And the suitcase accidentally fell open. And inside the suitcase were all these things from the hotel room, like sheets and towels and I don't know what else. And so she was asked, what are you doing? And she said, well, everything is empty, isn't it? So her interpretation of emptiness was that things don't really exist, so it's okay. I can take, things that don't belong to me, no problem. So anyway, I'm just trying to point out that misunderstanding, which apparently is easy to fall into. People do sometimes fall into that, thinking that the meaning of emptiness, the ultimate nature of things, is that nothing really exists. Nothing is really there. There's no me, there's no you, there's no anybody, there's no anything. And that's not correct. That's not the meaning of emptiness. So the meaning of emptiness is that things do exist. I exist, you exist, this room exists, this world exists. But they just don't exist the way we normally see them. So it's as though our mind sort of projects a way of existing onto things which isn't true, which isn't really there. Okay, so we sort of project a mode of existence, a way of existence onto everything, including ourself. I'm kind of going like this, but it also starts here with our own sense of who we are. I, me, myself. Yeah, this one here. So it starts there, the way we see ourselves, and then it also extends to others, other people, other beings, and everything else. Okay, so it's as though our mind projects onto everything a way of existing that isn't true, that isn't there. And the terminology used for this kind of false or untrue way of existing is sometimes it's called inherent existence or objective. There's actually a whole list of synonyms of this. Inherent existence, objective existence, true existence, and so on. And just those terms on their own probably don't say very much. Actually, one term that is used that I like, it's helpful for me, is independent existence. Things seem to have an independent way of existing, meaning that the way in which we see things is as if they exist all on their own, autonomously, cut off from, separate from everything else, independent of everything else. Independently existent. So for me, that term has a kind of juicy feeling, juicy mode to it, which helps me to think in that way. Because that way of existing just isn't true. And it's relatively easy to understand that things do not exist independently. Now, I've made this handout for you with some of the terminology, some of the concepts that we're going to be going through in the weekend, just so that you can have them written down there. So if you pull that out of your sheet, it's this yellow, it's a 3-page yellow handout. So right at the top of the first page, letter A, it says 3 ways that things exist dependently. Does everyone have a copy? Looks like some people. Do you not have a copy? Are there any extra copies, anyone? There will be, yeah.
If you raise your hand, we might not have enough, but we can make some for tomorrow. So I'm going to, maybe we'll share some tonight. Okay, and who else needs one? How many more do we need? Oh my heavens, are all of these empty? Oh, whoopee. It's like a little trick I was playing. It's all about emptiness.
So if you don't have one tonight, then you can look on your neighbors and we'll get more copies for tomorrow. Okay, so I've given them alphabetic numbers, alphabet letters, so that we can find them easily. So letter A says 3 ways that things exist dependently. Okay, so the reality, the truth is that everything that exists, whatever exists, does so dependently rather than independently. In other words, everything depends on other things for its existence. Nothing can exist without depending on other things. So there's 3 ways that things exist dependently. One is on causes and conditions. So let's just take our body, for example. Okay, so we all have a body, a physical body. So our body doesn't exist independently because, first of all, it came into existence at one point in time. It hasn't been here on this planet forever and ever and ever, but it came into existence at a certain point of time inside of our mother's womb. That's the only way a human body can come into existence. They haven't yet figured out how to produce them in laboratories or factories, so they have to come into existence inside of a womb of a human woman. And so those are the causes and conditions, the father's sperm and the mother's ovum, and then those came together, and there was fertilization, and then this little zygote started, and that gradually grew bigger and bigger and became a fetus, and then a baby, and then it came out, and so on. So we know that. We know how a body comes into existence. So it does so in dependence on causes and conditions. Without those causes and conditions, there would be no body, right? So that's not difficult to understand. And same with flowers or plants or trees. They have to come into existence in dependence on the seed and then proper conditions, soil, water, the right temperature. So only if those causes and conditions are there will a seed be able to turn into a plant, a flower, a tree, and so on and so forth. So that's one way things exist dependently. The second way is independence on parts. And that means that whatever exists has parts. So our body has many parts to it. There's the obvious parts that we can see, like the skin and the different organs inside, and the bones and blood vessels and so on. There's probably zillions of different parts to our body if we consider the very tiny parts, like the cells and the molecules and the atoms. So we can break down the parts of the body into finer and finer parts, and so again, that's not too difficult to understand. And without all those parts being there, we wouldn't have a body. The body wouldn't be there, right? That makes sense? So those are two ways that our body, as the example, exists dependently, and therefore doesn't exist independently. It doesn't exist on its own by itself, independently. Now the third way that things exist dependently is not easy to understand. And this is what we're going to be looking at over the weekend. This is they say to really understand emptiness, you have to understand this third one, but it's tricky. It's difficult to understand. It's called dependent on mental labeling. So what that means is we have this feeling, this sense, kind of gut level, intuitive, instinctive feeling that our body is like a real thing, existing all on its own, from its own side. That we could somehow point to something as being the body, as being the body. But as we just saw, it's actually made up of many, many different parts, zillions of parts. And all of those parts are not bodies. None of those parts is a body on its own, okay? It's just a part of a body, but it's not a body. And if we were to go through all of those parts, one by one, which would, maybe be rather boring, but it could be quite interesting, we would not be able to find anything we could point to as being a body. That makes sense? Okay? They're just parts of a body, not a body. So body, the body is just a name or and that is given to this collection of cells and molecules and atoms and blood and bones and skin and so on and so forth. All these parts, which themselves are not bodies. It's easier if we take maybe an object that has not so many parts to it, like a car. Okay, so when we see a car, if it's your car or somebody else's car, or a car that you would like to have, like a really fancy, luxury, expensive car. So again, there's sometimes this strong feeling of a real car there. Oh wow, if only I had that car. Wow, that would be so great, so wonderful. This desire can come up for the car. So at that point in time, there's a feeling like there's a real car over there. Car's a real thing existing on its own. But if we were to search for that real car that seems to be there, that we feel is there, and try to find it among all the parts that it's made of. We have the top of the car, the hood, the roof, I don't know all the names of the car. The doors, the sides, the wheels, the windows, the seats, and so on and so forth. So there's all these different parts. But none of those parts is actually a car. So car is actually just something that we name, we label onto all of those different parts. So in one sense you might think, well, that's not so difficult to understand, that's easy to understand. But it's actually not. To really understand that, to really get the meaning of that is actually something quite subtle. And they say that if you do get an understanding of that, it's like a jolt. It's like a bolt of lightning. His Holiness describes this. He said he'd been studying texts on emptiness for years and years and years, and thinking about it and meditating on it. But one day he was reading one of these Indian texts from one of the Indian masters about the emptiness of the self, the I, the me. And so he was reading a part of the text talking about that, and he suddenly got it. He suddenly got some experience of the meaning of that. And he said it was really like being struck by lightning. Really like lightning striking you. Because we have such a strong sense there's a real I, a real me, somewhere within this body-mind complex. And normally we never question it. We never, even think there's anything wrong with thinking that way. We're just kind of constantly acting on the basis of that belief in a real I. And so this whole teaching on emptiness asks us to question that, to look at that, What is this thing that I call I? And does it really exist in the way that it appears? Do I see myself in a realistic way? What is the I, anyway? So just looking at those kind of questions. And it said that when you do get a sense of the emptiness, the non-existence of a real, independently existing, inherently existing self, or I, or car, or whatever it is you're investigating, it can be quite a shock. Quite a shock. It can be quite scary, too. But they say it's good to prepare yourself for that. Prepare yourself for that kind of insight by understanding why we're doing this. Yeah, it's not just a game, it's not just for fun, it's not just for curiosity, but it's really because we want to free ourselves from suffering and then help others to be free of suffering as well. So if you have that understanding of the context of this whole topic and why we're investigating it, it said that then if you really understand that, then you can even feel a sense of joy. Sense of joy, like you have found a precious treasure, you have found something really, really precious. On the other hand, if you're not so fully prepared for it, then you may feel as if you've lost a precious treasure. Something really precious and important has been lost. So it can be a bit of a shock. So it's good to go about this investigation of the true nature of things with a great deal of care, and not just completely on your own, but under the guidance of teachers and the spiritual community who can help you along the way and so on. Okay, so those are the three ways that things are dependent. They exist in dependence on other things, and therefore they don't exist independently, all on their own, autonomous, cut off, separate by themselves. But we're just looking at that in a very brief way. We'll look at it more carefully as we go through the weekend. So now just to start looking at the sutra itself, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, which has emptiness as its main subject matter. So you also have this other handout where the sutra is written and it's divided into different sections. It looks like this. Oops, sorry. So the Heart Sutra belongs to a kind of collection of sutras which are called Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, or Prajnaparamita Sutras. So a sutra itself, the term sutra, is used for a teaching given by the Buddha. Okay, so it's one of Buddha's teachings. And there's many, many different sutras, hundreds or thousands, I don't know exactly how many, but lots of different sutras given by the Buddha. And among them, there's this one group of sutras which are called Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, or Prajnaparamita Sutras. And there are a number of these. I'm not sure exactly how many, but there were 17 of these sutras that were translated into Tibetan language. There might be others that were not translated into Tibetan, but in the Tibetan canon collection of sutras, they have 17. And there are varying lengths. The longest one is said to, it consists of 100,000 verses. I think it's in 12 books. So it's a lot. And then there's shorter ones, 25,000 verses, 8,000 verses, and so on. And then this one, the Heart Sutra, which is quite short. It fits on just 2 pages. And there's an even shorter one than this that consists of just one letter, the letter A, which is a negation, a negative term, and it means not in Sanskrit. So anyway, this is a short version of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And the topic, the subject matter of all these sutras is emptiness. And it's sometimes called the Perfection of Wisdom. So as I mentioned before, the meaning of wisdom. Wisdom is a state of mind. So emptiness itself is not a mind, it's not a consciousness. It's, again, if you look at your, let's see, no, it's not here. Yeah, we'll do that later. It's a kind of phenomena which is not something physical, okay, like our bodies, like this table, like cars and so forth. These are physical phenomena, matter, things we can see and touch and so on. So emptiness is not like that. It's not something we can see or touch. And it's said to be the true nature of all of these things. It's something that abides in all of these things, like our bodies and our minds and the tables and the cars and so on. So it's a way of existing that abides in, that exists in all of these things. So actually emptiness is with us all the time, around us all the time. It's right here. It's not somewhere up in space. It's not in some other dimension or realm, you know, we have to go to and find it. It's right here. Okay, it's right here with us all the time. We just don't see it because it's something very subtle and because our minds are kind of obscured by ignorance. We've just been in a state of ignorance for so long that we cannot see emptiness, which is the opposite to the way we usually see things. So it's actually right here with us all the time. And what we need to do is just work on our minds and clear away the obscurations that exist in our mind that prevent us from seeing emptiness. So it's actually right here all the time. So what we need to do is develop a particular state of mind which we call wisdom. So wisdom is a state of mind that's opposite to ignorance. It's just the opposite to ignorance. Ignorance is not seeing things as they are. Wisdom is seeing things as they are. Okay? So that's what we need to develop in ourselves, is the wisdom that sees the true nature of things, that sees emptiness, the emptiness of independent existence. So in these sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha explained how to develop wisdom, how to develop the wisdom that sees the true nature of things. And the reason this is called Heart Sutra is that of all the different Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, this one contains the heart or the essence of their meaning. So it's a sort of condensation of the main meaning of all the other Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. I think most of them haven't been translated into English. There's only a few that we have in English, such as this one. The Diamond Sutra, you may have heard of the Diamond Sutra, or it's also called the Vajracutter Sutra. That's also a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Have you come across that one? There are a number of English versions of that. And I think the 8,000 verse is translated, yeah, by Edward Kanza. Is that his name? Edward Kanzi was a scholar in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So he translated the 8,000 verse Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. But other than that, I don't think most of them have been translated into English. But they're also said to be very difficult. You know, if you just try to sit down and read these sutras, you probably won't understand much. They're not easy, they're difficult. So anyway, we're going to look at this one. And since it contains the essence, the heart of all the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, then it will help us get some idea of the meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And it is said that in the scholarly studies of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, that there are two meanings, two general meanings of these sutras. One is an explicit meaning and one is an implicit meaning. And actually that's letter B on your handout. You have trouble with these words. Letter B on the yellow paper, it says 2 levels of meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Number 1 is explicit. Explicit means like what's obvious, what's directly talked about. So mostly what is talked about is emptiness, the true nature of things. So that's the explicit, obvious meaning. But then it said there's also an implicit meaning. Implicit means it's kind of hidden. It's between the lines. It's not so obvious. So the implicit meaning is the method side of the path. This is the other wing of the bird. Remember I talked about those 2 wings that a bird needs to fly, or the 2 wings that a person needs in order to reach enlightenment. So one is the method, the wisdom side, understanding emptiness, and the other is the method side. And that has to do with how we actually progress along the path. So what are the different stages that we go through on the way to enlightenment? It's not a question of, one moment you're one moment you're not enlightened and the next moment you're enlightened. It just happens like in a flash like that. It's not like that. It's actually a progression. You pass through different stages on the way to enlightenment. We're going to look more at that later. But so that's implicit or hidden in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So in a simple way, we could say method involves developing love and compassion, the altruistic intention to help all living beings. That's what you need as your motivation to reach enlightenment. Your wish to reach enlightenment shouldn't be just, I want to get there for myself and enjoy that wonderful peace and bliss of enlightenment, but I want to do this to help others. I want to help all beings be free of suffering and help all beings be happy. And the best way I can help them is by becoming enlightened myself. So you need to have that as your motivation. Otherwise it won't work. If you're wanting to reach enlightenment for just a self-centered motivation, it's not going to work. So you need to develop that other side of the path. And then there are practices you do to cultivate that even further. So there's this term perfection. There's actually 6 perfections. Somebody who wants to reach enlightenment needs to practice what are called the 6 perfections. Some of you may have heard of those. Do you know what any of the 6 perfections are? Generosity, yeah, that's the first one. Huh? Ethical discipline, number 2. Number 3, patience, very important one. Renunciation, no, that's not one of them. Joyous effort is number 4. Concentration, number 5, and then number 6 is wisdom. Okay, so it said that the practices one needs to do to become enlightened are condensed into those 6. So there's generosity, giving, and ethics, number 2, which has to do with living our life in a non-harmful way as much as we can, trying to do good, trying to avoid bad. Then patience, learning how to put up with difficult people and not just blow our temper all the time. And then joyous effort is just taking delight, taking joy in doing what is good, what is helpful, just, not being bored with that, but having a lot of enthusiasm to do good things. And then concentration, training the mind to be able to stay focused on whatever object we choose without having it go here and there and all over the place. And wisdom, the last one. So these sutras, as I said, they're called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Okay, so it's the sixth of the 6 perfections. Do you know why it's called perfection? Any idea? Meaning of perfection. Paramita in Sanskrit. Actually, it's not a very good translation, but the meaning or the significance of the term perfection is if you engage in these practices with the motivation, with the altruistic motivation, the bodhicitta motivation. Okay, so a person might be practicing giving, for example, or concentration, but if they're not doing it with the bodhicitta motivation, the motivation of wanting to become enlightened to help all living beings, then it's not a perfection. So when it says perfection of giving, perfection of whatever, perfection of wisdom, it means that a person is engaging in those practices with that motivation, the altruistic intention. I'm doing this for the benefit of all living beings. I'm doing this because I want to become enlightened to help all living beings. So that's what makes it a perfection. Perfection of wisdom. So that means the perfection of wisdom means somebody is learning about emptiness, thinking about emptiness, meditating on emptiness, trying to understand emptiness with the motivation of wanting to help all living beings. So during this weekend, it's good if we can try to have that motivation as much as we can, even if it's not genuine, even if it's not 100% how you really feel, but you can fake it. Fake it till you make it. Yeah, because it does take time to really have that genuine feeling of I'm doing this to help all living beings. But if we just say that to ourselves, and this is what we do at the beginning of every teaching and every meditation session and so on, we try to think, I'm sitting here, I'm doing this so that I can become enlightened to help all living beings. So in the beginning it may just be words, but as you go on, it does start to become more and more real. It starts to feel, yeah, that's what I want to do. I really want to do that. And then it just gets easier and more real in your mind. Okay, just let's look at one more thing. Letter C on the handout. It says there are 4 types of perfection of wisdom. So perfection of wisdom, that term, perfection of wisdom, can refer to 4 things. One is called the resultant perfection of wisdom, and that is the Buddha's wisdom realizing emptiness. So in the mind of a Buddha, enlightened being, there is this wisdom. It's there all the time. It's never gone. 100% of the time, every minute, every second. A Buddha's mind has this wisdom that realizes emptiness, that sees the true nature of everything. Okay, so Buddha's always in that state of mind. That's the resultant perfection of wisdom. So that's what we are trying to work towards, what we are trying to achieve, being able to see emptiness all the time. And then a second type of perfection of wisdom is called the path perfection of wisdom. And that refers to a bodhisattva's wisdom, realizing emptiness. What's a bodhisattva? Right, so bodhisattva is a person who's on the way to enlightenment, who has this motivation of wanting to become enlightened, help all living beings. So they do this because they have compassion and love and they want to help all living beings. So that's the meaning of a bodhisattva. So it's like a medical student, somebody who's training to be a doctor. Not yet there, but learning how to do it. Okay? And so it's a Buddha to be. A bodhisattva is a Buddha to be. So in the mind of a bodhisattva, they also have to develop the wisdom realizing emptiness. So it starts off very small, they have to study and think about it and meditate on it, and eventually they'll get some realization of emptiness, and then that has to be cultivated more and more and more so they can have it more of the time and more perfect and more clear. So a bodhisattva is not yet a Buddha, not yet fully enlightened, but they're on the way. So they have also wisdom realizing emptiness, and that's called a path perfection of wisdom. Another kind of perfection of wisdom is scriptural, and that refers to sutras that explain either of those two types of perfection of wisdom. So like what we're looking at in this weekend, the Heart Sutra. So this is a scriptural perfection of wisdom. So we can also call it a perfection of wisdom because it's explaining how to develop perfection of wisdom. And the fourth type of perfection of wisdom is called natural perfection of wisdom, and that refers to emptiness itself. So emptiness itself is the natural perfection of wisdom. So of these four, it said that only the first one, the resultant perfection, is the real thing, the actual perfection of wisdom. That's the most perfect, the perfect perfection of wisdom. The others are kind of on the way there, but not yet fully perfect. Okay, so I think maybe that's enough for tonight. You might be tired. Some of you may have been traveling to get here today, and this is such a difficult topic anyway. But what I thought to do is just have you break up into little groups of 2 people or 3 people and just discuss with each other a couple of questions. Let's first I'll just say the questions and just let you think about them for a few moments, and then you can get together with 1 or 2 other people and just share your thoughts by way of an answer to these questions. Okay, so the first question I'd like you to think about and then talk about with your fellow classmates is, why is emptiness important in the context of Buddhism? So in the context of the Buddhist teachings, the Buddhist path, what is the importance, the significance of this topic of emptiness, which we are looking at in this weekend course? And then the second question is emptiness something important to you personally or not? So do you have some personal interest in or see some personal significance in this topic of emptiness or not? And why? Why or why not?